Long before colonial maps were drawn, Africa charted the stars, built cities of stone, and crowned divine kings. But they erased the timeline until now. What you're about to witness is not mythology, and it's not revisionism. It's history, suppressed, distorted, and forgotten. This is the Africa that predates conquest, that existed in its own cosmic rhythm, with its own centers of power, science, and spirit. For too long, the history of Africa has been compressed into a single tragic narrative of slavery and colonization. But what came before that is a far greater story, one of genius, gold, and galaxies. When we think of ancient civilization, most are taught to look eastward to Mesopotamia, Greece, Rome, or Egypt in isolation, as if Africa existed only as a backdrop to the grand theater of world history. But the truth is, Africa wasn't a blank canvas waiting to be discovered. It was already vibrating with astronomical knowledge, architectural mastery, and sophisticated systems of governance and spirituality. Let's start at the beginning. Not the colonial beginning, but the true beginning. Long before the Sahara became desert, it was a large expanse of green savanna filled with life, lakes, and people. These ancient Africans didn't just survive. They observed the skies, marked the solstices, and aligned massive stone structures with the movement of stars. At Napta Playa, near the modern border of Egypt and Sudan, an astronomical stone circle was constructed over 7,000 years ago. That's older than Stonehenge. These weren't just nomads. They were early scientists building cosmic temples to map time and honor the heavens. Farther west, in what we now call Algeria, at a place called Tassili Naja, lies one of the greatest open-air museums of human history. Thousands of rock paintings and carvings depict a world rich with spiritual ceremonies, agriculture, and advanced societies, dating back as far as 10,000 BCE. These are not the images of chaos or disorganization. They are the earliest visual records of humanity's quest for meaning, for balance with nature, and for connection with something higher. Meanwhile, along the fertile banks of the Nile, long before the unification of Egypt, cultures like the Badarian and Nakada were laying the spiritual and technological foundations of pharaonic civilization. These early Nile Valley peoples practiced sacred kingship, mastered irrigation, and built communities structured around a deep understanding of the cosmos. They revered balance, Ma'at, as a cosmic force, not just a moral one. In these societies, spirituality wasn't separate from science. The stars told stories. The sun measured time. The river itself was a divine artery. And then there were the ancient civilizations of the Sahara, cities that flourished long before desertification buried them in sand. Before the camel caravan routes and the trans-Saharan trade, there were settlements and networks connected by water and culture. In the early Niger River regions, there were societies planting the seeds of what would later become Nok, Mali, and Benin. These were the deep roots, the early echoes of empires to come. But ask yourself, why aren't these histories taught? Why do mainstream timelines jump from Egypt to Greece, from Rome to the Renaissance, with Africa disappearing somewhere in the margins? Who benefits from this erasure? And what do we gain when we remember? This is not just a story of kingdoms and dates. It's a story of worldview, of how time, power, and memory are shaped. To erase a timeline is to erase a people's place in history, and to erase that is to deny their role in shaping the world. Africa shaped the world. It birthed the first humans, the first calendars, and some of the first philosophies about life, death, and eternity. So in this documentary, we will journey through the true African timeline, from the prehistoric wonders that mapped the heavens, to the Nile's riverine empires that built cosmic cities, to the iron-smelting artists of Nok, and the mighty kings of gold and learning in Mali. We'll explore the coastlines where Swahili ships traded with China before Europe even knew those oceans, and the inland cities where libraries overflowed with manuscripts while castles in Europe still burned wood for warmth. This isn't a fantasy. This is history. African history. The kind that doesn't make it into textbooks. The kind that challenges everything we think we know about civilization, culture, and power. Let this be your first step in reclaiming that history. Because once you see the timeline they erased, you'll never look at the world the same way again. The Nile was not Egypt's alone. It was a shared cosmic river of power flowing south to north. When most people hear the Nile, they think only of pyramids, pharaohs, and the golden mask of Tutankhamun. But that iconic image is just a fragment of a vast and ancient story. The Nile was more than a river. It was a lifeline that connected a constellation of civilizations, each with its own vision of the divine, each contributing to one of the richest cultural tapestries in human history. This was a sacred artery of science, spirituality, and sovereignty, where black dynasties rose, fell, and left their marks, not just in stone, but in the DNA of global civilization. Around 3100 BCE, a unification took place in what would become known as Kemet, the land of black soil of black people. Two kingdoms, Upper and Lower Egypt, were brought together by a leader remembered as Nama or Menes. This unification wasn't just political, it was symbolic, a merging of cosmological systems, agricultural practices, and spiritual authority. The early dynastic period that followed gave birth to the world's most iconic structures, the pyramids. These were not tombs of ego. They were cosmic machines designed to mirror the stars, encode time, and reflect a divine order. Every brick, every angle was a conversation with the heavens. But Egypt, or Kemet, did not rise in isolation. Its very existence was entangled with older, southern civilizations that mainstream history often ignores or downplays. The kingdom of Tarseti, located in what is now southern Egypt and northern Sudan, predates dynastic Egypt and may have provided the very model of kingship and sacred rule that Kemet later adopted. This region, Nubia, was no periphery, it was the original source, the dark waters of the Nile from which northern grandeur was eventually drawn. By 2500 BCE, the kingdom of Karma emerged in Nubia. It was one of the earliest and wealthiest urban centers in all of Africa, with monumental architecture, vast burial sites, and a complex social hierarchy. Karma's power and culture rivaled that of Egypt, and archaeological evidence shows that it was not merely a follower, but a formidable parallel force. The Egyptian pharaohs themselves feared the strength of Kerma's armies, which at one point even marched northward to occupy parts of Upper Egypt. Later, out of the same Nile Valley came the Kingdom of Kush, a name that echoes through the Bible and ancient records with both reverence and fear. Based first in Apata and later in Meroye, the Kushites carried forward the legacy of Nubia with even greater complexity. These were the Black Pharaohs, rulers of the 25th dynasty, who conquered and ruled over all of Egypt itself. The great Pharaoh Pi led a peaceful campaign from the south, not to plunder Egypt, but to restore spiritual balance, uniting the land under Ma'at, the principle of cosmic harmony. Temples were restored, sacred texts were recopied. The Kushites did not merely rule, they revived. Meroye, the later capital of Kush, became a city of iron, art, and astronomy. While much of the classical world was still forging bronze, the Kushites had developed large-scale iron smelting industries, producing tools, weapons, and architectural elements with remarkable sophistication. Their pyramids, smaller, steeper, and more numerous than those of Egypt, remain scattered across the Sudanese desert. They stand today as silent testaments to a civilization that was as spiritual as it was scientific, as political as it was poetic. Further down the Nile and stretching eastward into the Horn of Africa was the fabled land of Punt. Referred to in Egyptian texts as God's land, Punt was a trading partner and spiritual king of Egypt. It was known for its wealth in gold, ebony, ivory, exotic animals, and most famously, frankincense and myrrh, sacred resins used in rituals and burials. Queen Hatshepsut, one of Egypt's greatest pharaohs, dispatched a legendary expedition to Punt around 1500 BCE. The journey was so significant that it was immortalized in relief on the walls of her temple at Deir el-Bahri. Punt wasn't imagined, it was real, and it was powerful. Its rulers met Egypt as equals, and its spiritual influence flowed into temples and tombs along the Nile. Even farther to the southeast, in the highlands of modern Ethiopia and Eritrea, early cultures were laying the groundwork for what would become the Aksumite Empire, a rising force that would eventually connect African trade with Rome, India, and Byzantium. These Proto-Aksumite societies, flourishing as early as the first millennium BCE, developed terraced agriculture, monumental stelae, and the religious traditions that would later form the backbone of Ethiopian Orthodox Christianity. Though they stand outside the Nile's direct path, they shared its cosmic worldview, one that saw kingship as sacred, land as divine, and time as eternal. All of these Nile-connected civilizations had one thing in common. They saw the universe as alive, ordered, and reflected in the physical world. Their temples were not just places of worship. They were microcosms of the cosmos. Their rulers were not merely political figures. They were living embodiments of divine forces. Their writing systems, from hieroglyphs to Meroitic script, were not just tools of administration, but portals into spiritual realms. To live in these civilizations was to live in dialogue with the universe. So why is it that we often hear about only one of them? Why is Kemet praised while Nubia is forgotten? Why are the black pharaohs of Kush left out of textbooks? Why is Punt dismissed as myth and the roots of Aksum buried in footnotes? The answer lies not in the evidence, but in the agendas. To acknowledge the fullness of Nile Valley civilizations is to accept that Africa was not a continent waiting for discovery. It was the beginning of discovery itself. As we move through this timeline, remember, power did not flow down the Nile, it flowed both ways. From Nubia to Egypt, from Punt to Thebes, from Kush to the world. This river carried more than water. It carried ideas, gods, gold, and greatness. It was the original bloodstream of civilization, and it ran black. The Nile was not Egypt's alone, it was Africa's cosmic river, and its banks were home to some of the most astonishing civilizations the world has ever known. While Rome rose, Africa already forged iron, built empires, and sailed trade routes from the Sahara to India. During the same centuries that the Roman Empire expanded its influence across Europe and the Mediterranean, Africa was no silent spectator. From the dense forests of West Africa to the rocky highlands of Ethiopia, from the vast desert trade routes of Libya to the bustling ports of the Red Sea, African civilizations were not only active, they were thriving. These were not isolated cultures, but expansive networks of innovation, diplomacy, and commerce. They forged metal, crafted art, irrigated deserts, and built cities that rivaled any in the classical world. And yet, much of their legacy has been buried beneath the sands of time, or deliberately left out of global history. One of the most formidable powers of this era was Carthage, a Phoenician African empire that dominated North Africa and much of the Western Mediterranean. Founded around the 9th century BCE in present-day Tunisia, Carthage evolved into a maritime superpower, rivaling Rome itself. Carthaginian ships ruled the seas, and their traders ventured as far as the British Isles and West Africa. At the heart of Carthage's success was its control of trade. Gold, ivory, textiles, glass, and spices moved through its harbors, connecting Africa to Europe and Asia long before colonialism. But Carthage was more than a merchant hub. It was a center of political strategy, religious tradition, and military genius. Hannibal, one of history's greatest generals, famously crossed the Alps with elephants to attack Rome, not as a barbarian, but as a commander of a highly organized African empire. Carthage stood as a symbol of African intelligence, ambition, and resistance, until Rome destroyed it in 146 BCE, burning its libraries and salting its fields to erase its memory. While Carthage ruled the coasts, deep inland in what is now Nigeria, a mysterious and remarkably advanced culture emerged, the Nok civilization. Existing from around 1000 BCE to 300 CE, the Nok people are among the earliest known in sub-Saharan Africa to work with iron. Long before the Iron Age swept across Europe, Nok blacksmiths were smelting iron ore to create tools, weapons, and farming implements. This technological leap revolutionized their society, enabling agricultural surpluses, urban growth, and political organization. But what makes the Nok even more astonishing is the art. Their terracotta sculptures, expressive, detailed, and abstract, reveal a rich cultural and spiritual life. These were not primitive people. They were artisans, thinkers, and innovators, setting the stage for later West African civilizations like Ife and Benin. Their cities, now lost to time and erosion, were early centers of African metallurgy and culture. To the north, across the expanse of the Sahara, rose another civilization that defies the desert's reputation for desolation, the Garamantes. Based in what is now Libya, the Garamantes established a powerful desert kingdom from around 500 BCE to 700 CE. At first glance, the Sahara may seem like an impenetrable barrier, but the Garamantes turned it into a highway. They developed advanced underground irrigation systems known as fogaras, tapping deep aquifers to transform dry landscapes into fertile farmland. With this innovation, they built cities, cultivated crops, and supported a growing population. The Garamantes became skilled desert navigators, controlling critical trade routes that connected West Africa with the Mediterranean. They dealt in gold, salt, and enslaved people. Though it is crucial to note that African systems of servitude during this era differed significantly from the industrialized chattel slavery imposed by Europeans centuries later. Roman records describe the Garamantes as fierce and independent, conducting raids deep into Roman North Africa while maintaining a strong and stable society of their own. Meanwhile, to the east, the Aksumite Empire was rising to prominence in the Horn of Africa. Centered in present-day Ethiopia and Eritrea, Aksum became one of the most powerful kingdoms in the world between the 1st and 7th centuries CE. It was a land of monumental obelisks, royal palaces, and sprawling trade networks. Aksum's strategic position allowed it to control the Red Sea trade, linking Africa with the Roman Empire, the Persian Gulf, and India. Goods like ivory, incense, spices, and textiles flowed through its ports. But Aksum's significance wasn't just economic, it was also spiritual. In the 4th century CE, under King Ezana, Aksum adopted Christianity, making it one of the first officially Christian nations in the world. This was not a borrowed faith. It was uniquely African, rooted in ancient Ethiopian traditions and connected to the broader Semitic and African religious worlds. Churches were carved into cliffs, monasteries were hidden in mountains, and Christianity took root in the Ethiopian highlands, where it would endure for millennia, untouched by Roman collapse or Islamic conquest. Further south along the Nile, the legacy of Kush continued in its later phase through the city of Meroe. As the capital of the Kushite kingdom from around 600 BCE to 300 CE, Meroe represented a fusion of African innovation and inherited Nile Valley tradition. While earlier Kushite rulers had dominated Egypt and built in a style, Meroe developed a unique African identity. Its art, writing, and religion reflected indigenous beliefs while still revering the legacy of the Black Pharaohs. Meroe's iron smelting industry became one of the most productive in the ancient world, with vast fields of slag and remnants of furnaces testifying to a booming economy. Its pyramids, though smaller than those of Giza, were more numerous and equally symbolic. Meroe was also a center of learning and literacy, with the still undeciphered Meroitic script etched into stone and pottery. This was a city of scholars and engineers, not just warriors. Throughout this classical period, Africa was not a passive participant in world history. It was shaping it. These civilizations, Carthage, Nok, Garamantes, Aksum, and Meroe, each contributed to the global story of innovation, faith, governance, and commerce. They developed independently, but they also interacted, traded, and influenced one another. The trans-Saharan trade routes weren't just paths for goods. They were channels of ideas, technologies, and belief systems. Yet, in most global histories, these names are rarely mentioned. Textbooks jump from Egypt to Greece, from Rome to Europe's Dark Ages, ignoring the African centers that were still illuminated by knowledge, wealth, and power. They tell us that Africa was in slumber, when in truth it was in motion. While Rome rose, Africa already forged iron. While emperors debated theology, Aksum had already embraced Christianity. While Europe clung to coastal trade, Carthaginian ships and Garamantic caravans had already mapped the ancient world. To remember this era is not to rewrite history, it is to restore it. It is to acknowledge that Africa was never silent, never empty, never lost. It was always active, always contributing, always rising. This was Africa's golden age. Cities glittered with gold, libraries overflowed with knowledge, and ships crossed oceans long before colonial sails appeared. As Europe entered its so-called Middle Ages, Africa was writing a different story, one of brilliance, abundance, and sovereign power. In the western heart of the continent, empires rose from the Sahel and savannas, turning desert sands into golden highways of commerce and ideas. These were not fragmented chiefdoms or tribal enclaves, but grand, centralized states with functioning bureaucracies, vast militaries, and networks that connected them to North Africa, the Middle East, and beyond. The West African empires of Ghana, Mali, Songhai, and Kanem Bornu were among the most powerful and sophisticated polities in the world during their time, and they thrived for centuries. The Ghana Empire, known to its people as Ouagadougou, was the first of these giants. By the 8th century CE, it had already established itself as the uncontested land of gold. Positioned strategically between the gold fields of Bambouk and the salt mines of the Sahara, Ghana controlled the trans-Saharan trade with such precision that nothing passed through its borders without royal permission. Camel caravans from North Africa would arrive loaded with salt, textiles, and horses, and leave carrying gold, ivory, and enslaved persons. This wasn't a chaotic exchange. It was highly regulated by a centralized authority with a royal court, taxation systems, and a professional army. The king of Ghana was so wealthy and powerful that Arab scholars described him as the richest man on earth, centuries before the rise of Mali. At the empire's height, its capital, Kumbisali, boasted two distinct cities, one for administration and trade, and the other for Islamic scholars and merchants. This dual structure demonstrated both Ghana's cosmopolitan openness and its commitment to sovereign control. But as trade routes shifted and internal pressures mounted, Ouagadougou's influence waned. From its ashes rose one of the most legendary empires in world history, Mali. Founded in the early 13th century by the brilliant warrior king Sundiata Keita, Mali quickly expanded its territory and influence, absorbing former Ghanaian lands and uniting diverse peoples under one banner. But it was under Mansa Musa in the 14th century that Mali ascended into global renown. Mansa Musa's pilgrimage to Mecca in 1324 remains one of the most iconic moments in African history. Accompanied by tens of thousands of attendants and camels carrying hundreds of kilograms of gold, he distributed so much wealth along the way that he disrupted the economies of cities like Cairo for years. But Mansa Musa was not just a symbol of opulence. He was a patron of education, architecture, and diplomacy. Under his reign, the city of Timbuktu became one of the world's greatest centers of learning. At Sankore University and other madrasas, scholars studied theology, astronomy, law, mathematics, and medicine. Thousands of manuscripts were produced and preserved, creating one of the richest literary traditions in Africa. Timbuktu was not just a city, it was a symbol of what Africa could be at its intellectual peak, of what was lost when these empires fell, and of what survives in the dusty libraries that still house ancient African wisdom. But history did not pause with Mali. In the late 15th century, a new empire emerged, even larger and more militarily sophisticated, Songhai. Led by rulers like Soni Ali and Askia Muhammad, Songhai expanded to become the largest empire in West African history, stretching from the Atlantic coast deep into the heart of the continent. Soni Ali was a military genius who used cavalry and naval forces to secure the Niger River and conquer major trade cities like Timbuktu and Djenné. But while his reign was characterized by aggressive expansion, his successor Askia Muhammad brought a different kind of power: administrative reform, religious scholarship, and a unified legal system based on Islamic principles. The empire was divided into provinces, each governed by appointed officials. A standing army protected its borders, while judges and tax collectors ensured stability and revenue. Songhai maintained Timbuktu's scholarly legacy and expanded it, making it a beacon for students and merchants from across the Muslim world. To the northeast, on the edge of Lake Chad, another great power was rising, the Kanem-Bornu Empire. Existing in some form since the 9th century and thriving through to the 19th century, this ancient Islamic kingdom was a major trade and cultural center long before European contact. Kanem-Bornu's rulers maintained diplomatic and scholarly ties with North Africa and the Islamic world, and they operated a powerful cavalry army that defended a vast and enduring state. The empire was unique in its longevity, surviving multiple dynastic shifts while maintaining its core structures of governance, trade, and Islamic scholarship. It was an example of political continuity and adaptability in African history, proving that African states could endure and evolve over centuries. Each of these West African empires operated as a self-sufficient world, yet they were all linked by networks of commerce, religion, and culture that tied the continent to the global stage. Their cities sparkled with gold not just in metaphor, but in economic fact. Their scholars debated philosophy while Europe grappled with feudal wars and religious fragmentation. Their armies marched with discipline and strategy, defending territories measured in thousands of miles. And yet, their achievements are too often overlooked or diminished in world history narratives. This was West Africa's golden age, a time when black kings ruled over golden empires, when knowledge flowed as freely as gold dust, and when the desert winds carried not silence, but the sound of marching armies, bustling markets, and sacred prayers. These were civilizations at their peak, and their legacy still whispers beneath the surface of modern Africa, waiting to be heard again. While West Africa traded gold and wisdom across the Sahara, Central and Southern Africa were shaping their own legacies, building stone cities, forging diplomatic ties with Europe, and mastering the rhythms of inland trade routes that pulsed through forests, rivers, and savannas. These regions were not marginal or disconnected. They were central to the story of African statecraft and civilization. Their kingdoms were sophisticated, their cultures rich, and their connections with the outside world deeper than commonly believed. In the Congo Basin, one of the most structured and well-documented African kingdoms emerged, the Kingdom of Congo. By the 14th century, Congo had established a powerful centralized state with a capital city, Mbanza, Congo, that Portuguese visitors later described as comparable in size and organization to European cities. The kingdom had a complex bureaucracy with provincial governors, a royal council, and systems of taxation. When the Portuguese first arrived on the coast in the late 1400s, they did not find a people awaiting discovery. They found diplomats, merchants, and a king capable of negotiating on equal footing. In fact, King Nzinga Nkuwu converted to Christianity and was baptized as Juan I in 1491, not as a surrender to foreign influence, but as a calculated political alliance. His successor, Afonso I, maintained correspondence with the Pope, requested teachers and clergy, and sent Congo's nobility to be educated in Europe. This was a kingdom that understood diplomacy and adaptation without sacrificing its sovereignty. To the southeast of Congo, across the savannas and river valleys of what is now the Democratic Republic of Congo and Zambia, rose the Luba and Lunda empires. These kingdoms, flourishing from the 16th century onward, developed unique models of governance based on sacred kingship and federated alliances. Luba society, in particular, was known for its complex oral traditions, preserved through memory boards called Lukasa, which served as mnemonic devices for recalling genealogies, histories, and laws. The Lunda extended these traditions, creating a vast network of affiliated states through diplomacy, marriage, and spiritual authority. These were not static tribal societies, they were dynamic polities with clear boundaries, legal systems, and ceremonial protocols. Trade in copper, ivory, and iron connected them to both coastal and interior markets, showing once again that Africa's heartlands were anything but isolated. Farther south, in the high plateau of present-day Zimbabwe, an architectural wonder emerged, Great Zimbabwe. Built between the 11th and 15th centuries, this massive stone city was the center of a powerful kingdom that controlled trade routes stretching to the Indian Ocean. Its stone walls, some over 5 meters high and constructed without mortar, still stand today, defying the colonial myths that once claimed Africans could not build in stone. At its height, Great Zimbabwe was a thriving metropolis, home to as many as 20,000 people. It served as a royal residence religious center, and trade hub, exporting gold and ivory to the Swahili coast and beyond. The artifacts found at the site, glass beads from Persia, Chinese ceramics, and Arabic coins, prove that this inland kingdom was deeply connected to global commerce. Preceding Great Zimbabwe was the lesser-known but equally important kingdom of Mapungubwe, located in present-day South Africa. Flourishing from the 10th to the 13th centuries, Mapungubwe was the first southern African state to organize a sacred kingship atop a hill, a symbolic separation of the divine ruler from the common population. Excavations have revealed golden scepters, figurines, and jewelry, clear signs of wealth, artisanship, and spiritual symbolism. Mapungubwe laid the cultural and political groundwork for Great Zimbabwe, proving that Southern Africa had its own lineage of state formation and civilization long before colonial disruption. In this golden age, Central and Southern Africa were not waiting to be awakened. They were wide awake, building cities, conducting diplomacy, and defining their own visions of wealth and power. Their achievements stand not in isolation but as vital chapters in the story of global civilization. Along the eastern edge of Africa, where the continent meets the Indian Ocean, a different kind of empire flourished, one built not on conquest but on connection. From the coral stone cities of the Swahili coast to the highland churches of Ethiopia, East Africa was a vibrant crossroads of commerce, culture, and faith. Here, the house caught the winds of the monsoon, carrying African gold, ivory, and spices to the markets of Arabia, India, and even China, and bringing back silks, ceramics, and knowledge. Long before the arrival of European navies, East Africa had already mastered the art of oceanic exchange. The Swahili coast was not a single empire, but a string of powerful, independent city-states that thrived between the 9th and 16th centuries CE. Kilwa, Mombasa, and Zanzibar were among the most renowned, bustling port cities with palaces, mosques, marketplaces, and multicultural communities. These cities were built by African hands, in African languages, but the reach was global. The Swahili language itself is a reflection of this blending. Rooted in Bantu speech, but shaped by centuries of contact with Arabic, Persian, and Indian tongues. Swahili culture was proudly African and proudly oceanic. Kilwa in particular became one of the richest cities in the Islamic world. Ibn Battuta, the famous Moroccan traveler, visited Kilwa in the 14th century and described it as one of the most beautiful and well-constructed towns in the world. Its merchants dealt in gold from Great Zimbabwe, enslaved peasants from the interior, and imported porcelain from China, a clear sign of a civilization deeply embedded in the Indian Ocean world. These were not accidental successes. The Swahili city-states had their own ruling classes, legal systems based on Islamic principles, and architectural traditions that combined coral limestone with intricate artistry. Their prosperity was built on diplomacy and navigation, not domination. They struck trade agreements, welcomed foreign scholars and sailors, and maintained stable societies for centuries. These were African port cities in full bloom, thriving before the Portuguese arrived with cannons and imperial ambition in the 1500s. Inland, across the highlands of modern-day Ethiopia, the Christian Ethiopian Empire stood as a mountain fortress of faith and power. With the roots going back to the ancient kingdom of Aksum, this enduring civilization embraced Christianity as early as the 4th century, centuries before most of Europe. But Ethiopian Christianity developed in its own way, blending biblical teachings with African traditions, Semitic languages, and local spirituality. The result was a unique religious culture that produced liturgical music, illuminated manuscripts, and stunning ecclesiastical architecture. Nowhere is this more evident than in the rock-hewn churches of Lalibela, carved directly into the earth in the 12th and 13th centuries. These structures were not built, they were revealed. Entire cathedrals, including underground passages and carved reliefs, were shaped from single pieces of stone. According to legend, angels assisted in their construction. Whether or not that's true, what is certain is this: no other Christian civilization left behind such a sacred feat of engineering. Ethiopia was not an isolated outpost of Christianity. It was its own theological kingdom, defending its sovereignty against Islamic incursions and remaining uncolonized by Europe for centuries. Together, the Swahili coast and Christian Ethiopia reveal an Africa connected to the world and to the divine. A place where faith, trade, and artistry came together in powerful harmony. Beyond empires lay the heartbeat of Africa, its spiritual systems, memory stones, and ancestral voices. While kings built cities and merchants sailed across seas, a deeper force pulsed beneath the surface of African civilization, a spiritual and cultural system that unified the continent across time and geography. Long before borders and dynasties, Africa was a land shaped by its relationship with the cosmos, the ancestors, and the unseen. Spirituality in Africa was not confined to temples or texts. It was in the land, the sky, the stones, the rhythm of drums, and the breath of storytellers. These systems were not marginal to African life. They were central, forming the philosophical and cosmological bedrock on which kingdoms and cultures were built. From the very beginning, sacred stones marked space and time across the continent. At Nabta Playa in present-day southern Egypt, ancient astronomers erected one of the world's oldest known megalithic structures, long before Stonehenge. These stones aligned with the stars, tracking solstices and celestial events, suggesting a deep and ancient awareness of the universe. Far to the south, at Great Zimbabwe, massive stone enclosures were constructed not only for political or economic purposes, but also to mark sacred space. The architecture itself followed symbolic and spiritual layouts, a silent language of stone that spoke of power, ancestry, and divinity. In West Africa, the Senegambian stone circles, thousands of laterite monoliths arranged in patterns, stand as mysterious sentinels of ancient rituals and cosmologies. Though their specific meanings remain partially veiled, their precision and repetition across hundreds of sites reveal a continent deeply engaged with sacred geometry and the metaphysics of space. This cosmic consciousness was reflected in the concept of kingship. Across Africa, rulership was rarely just political. Kings were not merely sovereigns. They were living symbols of the universe. In Kemet, ancient Egypt, the pharaoh was the son of Ra, the divine intermediary between gods and people. His rule was an expression of Ma'at, the principle of cosmic balance. In Yorubaland, the Oba was more than a king. He was a spiritual embodiment of the people's destiny, guided by oracles and ancestral forces. In Mali, the Mansa was not only a ruler of land, but a guardian of moral and cosmological order. And in the Kingdom of Congo, kings were seen as divine beings whose authority extended beyond life into the realm of ancestors. These leaders ruled with the blessing of priesthoods and oracles, and their legitimacy was grounded in ritual and cosmic alignment as much as in military might. Priesthoods across Africa were complex, organized, and highly specialized. In ancient Egypt, entire classes of priests maintained temples, performed rituals, and kept astronomical records. Their roles were not just religious, they were intellectual stewards of architecture, medicine, and philosophy. In Ethiopia, monasticism evolved into a spiritual and cultural force, preserving Christian traditions through centuries of isolation and resistance. Monks wrote manuscripts, taught theology, and maintained sacred continuity even as kingdoms rose and fell. In West Africa, spiritual systems like Ifa among the Yoruba guided both daily life and divine interpretation. The Ifa priest, or Babalawo, consulted the Odu, a system of sacred texts and binary codes used to interpret destiny, guide kings, and resolve communal issues. Among the Igbo, the Ofona Ogu represented divine justice, spiritual authority rooted in ancestral lineage and moral clarity. These were not just religious practices. They were frameworks for ethical living, legal arbitration, and philosophical reflection. But perhaps the most powerful cultural technology Africa ever developed was not carved in stone or written in scripture. It was spoken. Oral tradition was the spine of African memory. Through it, histories were preserved, genealogies maintained, and cosmic truths passed down from generation to generation. Griots, or oral historians, were not mere entertainers. They were living libraries trained in the rhythms, symbols, and syntax of ancestral memory. They could recite centuries of dynastic lineages, recount the laws of kingdoms, and transmit spiritual teachings in poetry, song, and parable. Among the Mandi, the griot's word was as binding as law. Among the Zulu, praise poets held court alongside kings, weaving oral memory into the heart of governance. Drums were modern instruments. They were speech. They encoded messages, announced events, summoned spirits, and communicated across villages and valleys. In many cultures, specific rhythms corresponded to sacred stories, historical events, or spiritual states. Masks, too, were not just art, they were sacred vessels. When worn in ceremony, they allowed the wearer to embody deities, spirits, and ancestors. The Dogon of Mali, for example, used masks in elaborate rituals that reflected their cosmology, which included star systems and galactic knowledge far ahead of Western astronomy. These rituals were immersive experiences, part science, part theology, part performance, through which the cosmos could be seen, felt, and understood. Across the timeline of African history, from prehistoric stone circles to the throne rooms of empires, spiritual systems evolved not in isolation, but in tandem with cultural, political, and scientific advances. These traditions were dynamic, absorbing, adapting, and innovating, while remaining anchored in core principles of balance, ancestry, and the sacredness of life. They offered models of leadership grounded in cosmic order, social systems rooted in moral law, and ways of knowing that honored both the seen and the unseen. So while the world marvels at Africa's gold, architecture, and empires, it is this spiritual and cultural continuity that truly defines the continent. It is the thread that ties Nubia to Mali, Ife to Ethiopia, Zimbabwe to the Nile. It is a legacy of cosmic insight, moral intelligence, and artistic brilliance, carried not just in books or buildings, but in the living breath of elders, in the coded language of drums, and in the sacred stories whispered through generations. In the end, it is these systems, not just the kingdoms, that endure. They are the memory stones of Africa, and they are still speaking.
Europe did not discover Africa. It encountered civilizations already centuries ahead in trade, governance, and culture. By the time European ships appeared on African shores in the 1400s, they were not sailing into an empty or forgotten continent. They were arriving late to a world already deeply in motion, one that had established powerful empires, thriving economies, and international trade networks stretching across deserts, rivers, and oceans. What the Portuguese and other European powers found in Africa was not a blank map, but a series of organized sovereign states, many of which had already cultivated their own diplomatic and commercial ties across the Islamic and Indian Ocean worlds. These early encounters were not marked by conquest, but by negotiation, alliance, and cautious mutual interest. The Portuguese were the first Europeans to establish sustained contact with sub-Saharan Africa, navigating down the West African coast in the mid-15th century. Their goal was not just exploration, it was gold, spices, and access to established African trade networks. When they arrived in places like the Kingdom of Congo and the cities along the gold and slave coasts, they encountered rulers who were fully capable of managing international relations. In fact, the Kingdom of Congo, under King Nzinga Nkuvu, later baptized John I, entered into diplomatic and religious dialogue with Portugal by the 1490s. This was not a submission to European power, but a strategic alliance forged by equals. Congo's elite sent envoys to Lisbon and even the Vatican. The kingdom adopted Christianity on its own terms, integrating it into existing spiritual frameworks rather than abandoning its identity. Throughout the late 15th and 16th centuries, African rulers maintained control over their coasts, customs, and trade infrastructure. European traders were restricted to designated ports, where they were subject to taxes, inspections, and the authority of African officials. In cities like Elmina, the Portuguese built forts with African permission, paying tribute for land use and agreeing to local laws. African merchants and political leaders continued to dominate inland trade routes from the Niger River to the forests of Central Africa. The flow of goods, gold, ivory, collar arts, copper, textiles remained in African hands. For a time, Europe was just one trading partner among many, and not yet the most powerful. But alongside this exchange, another more sinister current began to rise, one that would eventually rupture the continent's stability: the Atlantic slave trade. At first, enslaved persons were a small part of the commercial interactions, exchanged in limited numbers for firearms, beads, and metal goods. Many African states had internal systems of servitude, often based on war capture or death, and not necessarily permanent or hereditary. But as European demand grew, especially in the Americas, so too did the pressure to supply human labor on a massive industrial scale. Some African leaders initially participated in this trade with calculated control, seeing it as an extension of existing practices. But as the 16th century progressed, the nature of the exchange began to shift. Raids intensified. Rival kingdoms armed by Europeans turned against each other. Political destabilization increased as European powers began bypassing African intermediaries, using their growing military and maritime strength to interfere directly in local affairs. What had begun as a series of diplomatic encounters was slowly turning into a system of extraction of wealth, bodies, and sovereignty. This transitional period, from the late 1400s to the early 1600s, was not the beginning of European domination. It was the end of African control over its own narrative. The kingdoms that had once dictated terms to foreign traders were now facing the early tremors of colonization. The balance of power had not yet fully tipped, but it had begun to shift. Still, the record is clear. Africa was not discovered. It was approached. It was negotiated with. It was respected. For a time, and in that brief window before the full weight of colonialism crashed down, Africa stood tall, not as a land waiting for histories, but as a continent already rich in it. From the stones of Napta Playa to the walls of Great Zimbabwe, this has always been more than a timeline. It is a memory map etched across millennia.
We began this journey with erased names and silenced civilizations, yet we found that Africa was never lost. It was living, in the stars that guided ancient astronomers, in the gold that glittered across Saharan empires, and in the voices of griots echoing through time. We traveled through sacred deserts, golden savannas, mountain monasteries, and coral coasts. Every step reminded us Africa's timeline is not a tale of beginnings and ends. It is a river flowing through the ages, uninterrupted, undeniable, and foundational to the world as we know it. But somewhere along that river, the flow was interrupted. Not by a lack of brilliance, but by a deliberate distortion. Colonialism redrew the map and narrowed the lens. Entire civilizations were downsized to footnotes. Empires became myths, scholars became legends, until their names were forgotten altogether. This was not a historical accident. It was an agenda, a systemic effort to frame Africa as a continent of darkness rather than the source of light. And yet, what they erased was not Africa's greatness. It was the world's awareness of it. They erased the timeline, not the truth. And now, the truth is resurfacing. We are the generation that remembers, the ones who refuse silence, the ones who trace the ancient roads back to their source, not to relive the past, but to restore it, to reclaim it. We are the witnesses and the keepers of this story, and it is no longer hidden. The drums are still beating, the stones are still speaking, and the ancestors are still watching, waiting for us to lift their names again. If this journey moved you, don't let it end here. Like this video to honor your ancestors. Comment below and share your thoughts. Your heritage was silenced. Subscribe to History Store for more untold stories, more truth, more power. Because history lives when we speak it.